Before alcohol became common, before tobacco spread across the world, human beings were already using cannabis. Archaeological evidence suggests that cannabis is one of the very first plants ever cultivated by humanity, not just for intoxication, but for survival. In fact, hemp fibers found in Taiwan date back nearly 10,000 years, making it one of the earliest domesticated crops. Its strength, versatility, and medicinal properties made it indispensable. In ancient China, cannabis was known as ma and was used in textiles, rope, and medicine. The legendary physician Shen Nong, who lived nearly 5,000 years ago, included cannabis in the earliest pharmacopoeia of Chinese medicine. He wrote that hemp seeds nourished the body, while other parts of the plant could be used to treat pain, rheumatism, and digestive problems. But cannabis wasn't only practical, it also carried deep cultural and spiritual significance. Ancient Scythians, the nomadic horsemen of Central Asia, used cannabis in funerary rites. The Greek historian Herodotus described them throwing hemp seeds onto heated stones, filling their tents with thick, intoxicating smoke during rituals of purification. Archaeologists have since confirmed Herodotus's account, uncovering Scythian burial mounds containing braziers, hemp seeds, and burnt cannabis residue. India provides another essential chapter. In the Vedic scriptures, dating back over 3,000 years, cannabis, called bhang, is referred to as a sacred plant. It was associated with the god Shiva, known as the Lord of Bhang. Devotees believed the plant granted spiritual clarity, relief from suffering, and a sense of union with the divine. Even today, bhang is consumed in religious festivals such as Holi, linking modern traditions to their ancient origins. From the beginning, cannabis was far more than a drug. It was food, clothing, medicine, and a doorway to the sacred. It spread through trade routes and nomadic cultures, carried by migrating peoples from Central Asia into India, China, and the Middle East. Every civilization that encountered it seemed to adapt cannabis to their own needs and beliefs, ensuring that this single plant would become embedded in multiple layers of human history. So when we talk about cannabis, we aren't just talking about as cannabis moved along ancient trade routes. It didn't just spread as a material or a medicine. It embedded itself into the spiritual fabric of countless cultures. In India, its sacred role endured, but across Asia and the Middle East, it began to take on new meanings. In Taoist China, cannabis seeds were believed to bring longevity and were sometimes combined with ginseng and other herbs in alchemical experiments. Taoist mystics saw the plant as a way of aligning body and spirit with the natural world. Archaeological finds in Western China have even uncovered burial remains where cannabis plants were laid across the chest of the deceased, a striking symbol of its connection to life, death, and transcendence. In the Middle East, cannabis evolved into what we now know as hashish. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Sufi mystics were using it in spiritual practices, believing it could bring ecstasy and closeness to God. Though controversial even then, its use spread rapidly. In medieval Cairo, for example, entire districts became associated with hashish dens, where social and religious boundaries blurred. Africa, too, embraced cannabis in unique ways. Arab traders introduced the plant to the continent through the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade routes around the 10th century. By the 13th century, cannabis smoking was common in Ethiopia, often linked with religious ceremonies. In parts of southern Africa, cannabis was incorporated into healing rituals, used by shamans to enter trance states and commune with ancestors. This cultural adoption was not uniform. It reflected the creativity and diversity of human societies. In India, cannabis was consumed as bhang in milk-based drinks, often by priests and devotees. In the Islamic world, it was transformed into hashish, concentrated and smoked socially or spiritually. In Africa, it became part of shamanic and communal traditions. What all of these practices had in common was the recognition of cannabis as more than a plant. It was seen as a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, between the living and the dead, between the individual and the community. Its ability to alter consciousness was never treated as an accident. It was revered as something powerful, even sacred. By the time Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, cannabis had already traveled far beyond its Asian origins. But in Europe, its role was very different. Rather than being primarily spiritual, cannabis was valued as an industrial powerhouse. Hemp became one of the most important fibers in European society. From the ropes of Viking ships to the sails of Spanish galleons, hemp quite literally helped launch the age of exploration. Strong, durable, and resistant to salt water, hemp was the backbone of maritime empires. Without it, Columbus might never have crossed the Atlantic, and Britain could never have ruled the seas. Medical use also grew in Europe. In the 16th century, physicians like Paracelsus and later Nicholas Culpeper recommended hemp preparations for ailments ranging ranging from ear infections to burns. It was often sold in apothecaries as seeds, oils, or tinctures. But unlike in Asia or the Middle East, Europe rarely embraced cannabis for its psychoactive effects. The continent's relationship was mostly practical: rope, cloth, paper, medicine. The Age of Empire brought cannabis into entirely new dimensions. As European powers expanded into Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they encountered local traditions of cannabis use that surprised and sometimes alarmed them. Portuguese sailors brought stories of Africans smoking cannabis in clay pipes. The British observed bhang and ganja, deeply embedded in Indian religious and social life. The French saw hashish dens in North Africa and wrote exoticized accounts of altered states and mystical visions. By the 18th and 19th centuries, cannabis had become part of colonial economies. In India, the British East India Company quickly realized how lucrative the cannabis trade could be. Taxes on bhang, ganja, and charas were levied to fill colonial coffers. The colonial government in India even ran detailed surveys on cannabis use, trying to balance profit with social control. In Egypt, the French occupation under Napoleon introduced Europeans to hashish, sparking both fascination and moral panic back in Paris. At the same time, hemp production was intensifying in the Americas. In the Chesapeake colonies, farmers grew hemp alongside tobacco, and George Washington himself recorded planting hemp at Mount Vernon. Again, it was rope and sails that drove this. America's early naval ambitions depended on it. This period marked a turning point. Cannabis was no longer just a sacred herb, nor just a plant for rope and cloth. It had become an economic tool of empire. Colonizers taxed it, exploited it, and exported it. And yet, paradoxically, the plant also became a way for colonized peoples to preserve culture and resist. In India, bhang continued to be consumed during Hindu festivals despite colonial disapproval. In Egypt, hashish remained part of daily life despite bans. Cannabis endured because it had deep roots that no empire could rip out. As the 19th century rolled into the 20th, however, the story took a darker turn. What had once been sacred, medicinal, and useful began to be reframed as dangerous. Western nations, particularly the United States, launched a campaign that would redefine cannabis worldwide. By the late 19th century, cannabis had become a subject of fascination in the West. Writers in France's Club des Hachichin experimented with hashish and wrote vivid accounts of its effects. In the United States, cannabis tinctures were sold in pharmacies and included in medical guides. Yet at the same time, shifting social and political winds began to change how the plant was viewed. The Industrial Revolution had created a society obsessed with order, productivity, and control. Anything that altered consciousness or slowed work was treated with suspicion. Alcohol faced its own prohibition movements, and cannabis, especially as it became associated with marginalized groups, fell under the same shadow. In the US, this shift was accelerated by immigration. In the early 20th century, Mexican workers who fled the revolution brought with them the custom of smoking cannabis recreationally, which they called marijuana. In the Southwest, newspapers quickly sensationalized the practice, tying it to crime and moral decay. Racist rhetoric painted cannabis as something foreign and dangerous, a threat to American youth. This moral panic culminated in the 1930s. Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, launched an aggressive anti-cannabis campaign. He circulated lurid stories, claiming cannabis made men violent, turned women promiscuous, and even caused insanity. His efforts led directly to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, effectively banning cannabis in the United States. The infamous propaganda film Reefer Madness was released soon after, cementing cannabis in the public imagination as a substance of danger and moral collapse. Other countries followed America's lead. Under pressure from international treaties and the emerging United Nations drug control system, cannabis was outlawed across much of the world in the mid-20th century. Ancient traditions were criminalized. Farmers in India and the Middle East were forced underground. In Jamaica, where cannabis had been central to Rastafarian culture, police crackdowns were brutal. In Egypt and North Africa, centuries of hashish use were suddenly labeled criminal. By the 1960s and 70s, cannabis had become more than just a plant. It was a cultural statement. Young people in the United States and Europe rejected the rigid moral codes of their parents and embraced cannabis as a symbol of peace, freedom, and rebellion. Musicians like Bob Dylan and the Beatles referenced marijuana in their lyrics, and festivals like Woodstock turned it into a cultural icon. At the same time, cannabis spread through universities and activist circles, linking it to movements against war, racism, and authoritarianism. Governments responded with repression. In the US, President Richard Nixon declared a war War on Drugs in 1971. Cannabis was classified as a Schedule I drug, the same category as heroin, officially defined as having no medical use and a high potential for abuse. This was a political decision, not a scientific one. Nixon's own advisors later admitted that the policy was designed to target anti-war activists and black communities. Arrest rates soared, and millions were criminalized for possession of a plant that had been used safely for thousands of years. Yet cannabis culture did not disappear. Instead, it spread globally. In Jamaica, Rastafarian culture tied cannabis directly to spirituality and resistance. In Amsterdam, the Dutch adopted a tolerant approach, allowing cannabis coffee shops that became world famous. In the US, despite harsh laws, cannabis festivals, music, and underground networks flourished. Meanwhile, scientists were beginning to rediscover what ancient cultures already knew. Cannabis had profound medical potential. In the 1980s, researchers identified the body's endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors that interact with compounds in cannabis. Studies revealed that cannabis could reduce nausea, ease chronic pain, help with epilepsy, and improve the lives of patients with conditions ranging from multiple sclerosis to cancer. The claim that cannabis had no medical value was now scientifically untenable. By today, cannabis is legal for medical or recreational use, but the legacy of prohibition remains. Communities that were most heavily criminalized, especially black and indigenous groups in the United States, continue to face barriers, even as corporations profit from a new legal cannabis industry. Activists argue that true justice means not only legalization, but also reparations and equity in this billion-dollar market. So, when we look at cannabis today, in dispensaries, in medicine, in culture, we are seeing the latest chapter in a story more than 10,000 years old. From ancient shamans to modern scientists, cannabis has always been more than just a plant. It is a mirror of humanity itself, our search for healing, our struggles with control, and our endless fight for freedom. And if you found this journey through history fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. How do you think the future of cannabis will unfold? Will it become a fully global industry, or will stigma still hold it back? Let's talk about it.